everybody. This is another book analysis for Systems of Human Performance. Today what I wanted to do is something a little different. Rather than looking at one book and dissecting it and figuring out the themes and figuring out kind of the main ideas of that particular text, what I wanted to do is actually combine two texts. So the first text that we're going to look at today is a book that I found just at a used bookstore. I thought it was an interesting title and an interesting idea. It's a book that's 50 years old already. It's called Changing Attitudes Toward American Technology, and it's written by a guy named Thomas Park Hughes. And what this book is it's really an anthology of primary texts. And what Hughes does is he goes through different eras of the American history and takes different essays and different speeches and different events that people are writing about as primary sources and putting them together to kind of mold a coherent narrative about that time and place. What were people thinking about and saying in the 1830s? What were their views on technology, on the relationship between the national character and politics and the steam engine, and so on and so forth? And then they would do that, or Hughes does that for the later 19th century and the early 20th century and the mid-20th century. So it's actually a really helpful text to get an understanding of different trajectories on how we think about and view technology. And what I wanted to do after going through that this anthology of primary texts is I wanted to grab one of our own contemporary primary texts and kind of pull that apart and say, well, what are the views that we currently espouse in our society today? How does this compare with what we've seen in the history in Hughes's anthology? So the primary source that I'm picking now for this contemporary moment is the 2023, I think it's 2023, Techno-Optimist Manifesto by Mark Andreessen. If you haven't read it, it's I think it's certainly made the rounds. I think it's certainly kind of mimetic, and I think it does a very good job of explaining what kind of our contemporary society thinks about technology and how they view it and how they view humanity's and civilization's relationship to technology. So what I want to do in all of this is refrain from judgment. I don't want to get into this and saying, look how silly these people of the 1830s were. Look what they thought about the steam engine, or look what they thought about utopia. And rather what I want to do is just come into this to show the shape and the flavor of where we've been in history and perhaps where we're going. I think it's very important with any of our views, our opinions, or our beliefs is to understand where we are societally, historically, on the spectrum of beliefs. So, for instance, many people alive today, we would reject the idea of a political empire. We would say, "Oh, that doesn't work for us. It's politically deficient, or doesn't meet the needs of the people." We would say probably the same thing for monarchy, right? Nobody here is really advocating for a monarchy. Yet, of course, those are our beliefs, but we also need to understand where we are in society. There are not any active empires. There are not any active monarchies, not in the way we think about them anyway. So surely where we position ourselves on the spectrum in our society, where we find ourselves in the present moment of history, is definitely having an impact on our own held beliefs and thoughts. We can say the same thing for slavery, right? It's like many people throughout history, this is a very peculiar moment in the West where we actually find ourselves without widespread slavery. And that's, of course, shaping our beliefs and shaping what we think a good society is about. Now, certainly 200, 300 years ago, people would have different beliefs about slavery because not just because they're inferior or something like that, but mainly because the society that they were surrounded in was indeed shaped by that institution. And we can go on and on about this sort of thing. I had a conversation, a theological conversation with a friend, is hell real or not? And well, there's actually, in theological circles, there's this very well accepted belief in this decline of hell. So whether or not hell exists from a theological perspective is not my point here. But if we look and trace how people have thought about what hell is, or if it exists, we actually find ourselves on a very, very, very peculiar moment in the disbelief of hell than people have for 10,000 years, not just in the Christian West. So that's what I hope you take away from this, is that the trajectory of how we think about technology and our beliefs about technology is definitely shaped by the institutions and the present moment around us. And if there's any definite thing we can say about this, it's certainly that what we believe now is not what we'll believe in the future. Things are going to change. They will change relatively quickly, much quicker than we probably even anticipate. So with that, let's jump into this anthology text by Hughes. Now, I've gone ahead and done a little bit of summarizing of this book, so I have that on my screen. He divides this into a couple different epochs. The first one kind of takes place in the early to mid-early 19th century, and he calls that the era of technological enthusiasm. He then moves into the later 19th century, even into the early 20th century. He calls that the age of industrial power and anxiety. From there, he moves into this something roughly around the 1910s, kind of coming out of World War I up until World War II. This he calls the technocracy and expert state. He moves then into kind of this post-war period with the Cold War coming up. We could call this mid-century confidence and Cold War ambivalence. Roughly takes us to the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. And then epoch number 5 is taking us from the 1960s, punctuated by kind of that Cultural Revolution, maybe Summer of Love, 1967, up until when he's writing this book, which again is in 1975. I could go and I could find different primary sources on how things have shaped us from 1975 as well. There's certainly 50 years of change going on there. But what we'll do after we've dived deep into each of these different epochs is we will return to a more contemporary piece in Techno-Optimist Manifesto, look at some of the main themes there, and take that one solo primary piece, primary source, as our source of truth in what people are saying contemporarily today. So this first epoch, the era of technological enthusiasm, what was going on there? Well, the steam engine was coming on. You would have different technologies like the big textile mills, the flying jennies. These were the sorts of technologies that was really shaping American society. Of course, this is what we think of when we think of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the texts that Hughes pulls out of this era deals with the concept of utopia. Finally, for the first time, we're moving beyond a subsistent society. We're no longer just agrarian people. Technology is actually seen as kind of a moral force, a force for good, a force for becoming, and a force for abundance and affluence. So a lot of the texts that are coming out of this time is really trying to create an understanding or create an idea of a technological utopia, or a utopia on the backs of technology. You can think of a lot of theological things happening in America at this time too. You have the Second Great Awakening, where you have many of these utopian sects, like the Seventh-day Adventists, like the Mormons, are coming out at a similar time, and certainly there's a good cross-pollination between those ideas. Now, another thing that's coming on here is we're still a burgeoning nation. We're just about 50, maybe 70 years old as Americans, and people are trying to understand democracy through the lens of technology. How do these two things couple with one another? And one of the things that people come up with, somebody like Olmsted, he's arguing that these institutions of science and technology have democratic tendencies themselves. They have a tendency to flatten class distinctions. They have a tendency to spread wealth and empower ordinary citizens against the old form of political economy, like aristocracies and monarchies and so on and so forth. That's an interesting idea. I think we'll actually see that come back around when we get to Techno-Optimist. And then there's also this coupling of technology and invention as part of the national identity of Americans. I think this is something we still see today, right? Is that, we're Americans, American ingenuity. We're here because of our know-how, and that's what's made America great. This idea, this belief has really come about as early as the 1930s, 1940s. E.W. Brin documents the extraordinary pace of American invention, and he says this is because of our unique national genius. We have the patent system, we have the inventor, and these essentially become icons of who Americans are. We think of the great Thomas Edison as a quintessential American because he was that tinkerer, that person who had the grit and the know-how to do things. So those are kind of some of the key ideas that pepper epic number 1, kind of our early 19th century age. If we move over to epic number 2, this is what we titled the Age of Industrial Power and Anxiety. Here, people are wrestling with a number of kind of very scaled and very vast industrial systems. You have railroads, you have electrification, you have steel, but you also have kind of the culmination of urbanization. So when we learn about the Industrial Revolution in school, we always talk about urbanization, right? Now everyone's moving to the city for factories, and cities are full of soot from the factory smokestacks, and it's not a great place to live. Well, of course, that didn't happen overnight, and what we're kind of seeing is by the late or mid to late 19th century, that's culminating, and people are starting to take note of that. So one of the big essays that Hughes brings into this is Henry Adams, who is a descendant. I think he's like the grandson of John Adams and maybe the son of John Quincy Adams, or maybe one generation removed. I can't exactly remember. But he's writing this piece called The Dynamo and the Virgin. And the main idea of this piece is really that the machine is a sublime force. It's definitely shaping not just society, but humanity itself. But it's also kind of an alien force. He's using this term, the dynamo. I had to Google what it was. It's an electric generator. We don't use the term anymore, but apparently it was in vogue in the late 19th century. He's using that as kind of the symbol of modern industrial power. And sorry, Google's answering my question about what a dynamo is. But he's talking about this, but he's also saying that this dynamo is giving way to a new form of God, and this God is incomprehensible and morally indifferent, and it's displacing the spiritual and human center of civilization. So he's noticing that technology itself is changing kind of some of the institutions and mode of living for humanity. The next thing that we see in this era is the rise of the engineer and the expert. So previously, we think of quintessential Americans like Thomas Edison, almost like Henry Ford as well, Andrew Carnegie, you kind of your big industrialists. And all these people were essentially, uneducated tinkerers, uneducated people who are trying new things and creating science through the trial and error method. In the 19th century, the late 19th century, we get figures like Robert Millikan and R.H. Thurston who are creating a new scientific professional class, and they're celebrating this. They're saying, yes, what we really need is kind of a vanguard of people who understand the fundamentals of physics, of chemistry, of engineering, and these people are really going to elevate our science and technology, and they're going to take us into the future. So this is actually very similar. At the same time, you've got this guy in Russia named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and he's coming up with the same idea about society, right? So we need to have this vanguard class to lead the proletariat into a communist revolution. So different application, but kind of this same thing in the zeitgeist, right? Is we need a class, an elevated class, to lead the others. And it is no longer up to the farmers and the tinkerers to come up with science. This now belongs to the university and research institutions and properly trained scientists. So this is a very, very important and consequential change in how we view science, and I would contend that it is still with us today. Third, what we would see in this epoch is a interrelation between technology and science and national security. So we actually get a piece from Thomas Edison towards the end of his life where he's actually talking about how to design a navy. And I don't want to get into the technical details of it. It's actually quite boring. But what it shows is a new reflection of how industrialists are shaping modern politics, modern being early 20th century, as well as dictating how we're going to be waging war in the 20th century. And certainly we see, with the mechanized warfare of World War I and World War II, that's truly come to fruition. But we get a glimpse of that in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that Edison piece was written right before World War I. It's kind of interesting. So that takes us to epoch number 3. So epoch number 2, just in summary, right, is we're still continuing this kind of like technology triumphant path. We're starting to get a little awakened to an understanding of, well, there are things that technology is costing us. This idea of utopia is gone. We don't think that we're going to live in abundance forever anymore. And we see, especially in the Adams piece, that, okay, this is actually maybe costing us some of our historic cultural character in the terms of spirituality or something to that sort. Epoch number 3, which is the technocracy and the expert state, to me is kind of the culmination and the final chapter in this triumphant technology path. From here on, it's going to get a little bit more ambivalent. It's going to get a little more questioning of the role of technology. But what we see is after World War I and up until World War II, this idea of that technological professional class, the educated scientists and engineers, actually is elevated even further. And there's this guy named A.D. Little. He creates this idea called technocracy. And essentially what he believes, and we don't learn about this in school, but it was actually very, very popular. It was its own political party of the 1920s. He actually had this idea of a fifth estate of technological experts. So we think of estates, that's going back to the French Revolution, where you had the first estate was your aristocracy, your second estate was your priestly class, and then their idea was the third estate, the French Revolution, was kind of the everyman, the people who actually embodied the French Revolution. Well, A.D. Little is taking that idea and he's advancing it and saying, well, we need a new estate of technical experts who should become the ruling class. And this is the idea that's very popular at that time of rational and technological management can solve social problems that democracy seems unable to address. Now, going back to the 1930s, where we started this thing, remember, technology was supposed to have democratic tendencies. It was supposed to lead to utopia. So what we see here is kind of a moving away from that. And again, 1920s, the communist revolution just happened in Russia. This is actually trending towards something like central planning. I'm not saying it's communism proper, but there's definitely this idea of centralized planning going on in America. I think there was Huey Long, I think was his name perhaps, was kind of more of a centralized planner. Even somebody like FDR certainly had these centralizing planning tendencies that are coming through in this progressive era in America through the Great Depression, and essentially we're trying to use technological know-how to solve these issues. FDR is perhaps a really good example of this, because what we actually ended up doing is creating lots of public works through the use of technology to get out of the Great Depression, right? Think of the New Deal, think of the Hoover Dam, think of electrifying, the middle of the country. That is essentially the program that's being presented here. The selections that Hughes takes in this anthology just takes that to its utmost degree, where it actually is saying, this, but also we should be the ruling class, not just the advisors. So if we could summarize it, right, it's this interrelationship between social dysfunction and technological know-how to solve that dysfunction. And of course, this comes on the back of this new professional class that we just saw was invented 30, 40, 50 years prior, which didn't even exist. So essentially what we see in this trajectory is this professional class is created, and then they're trying to seize political power relatively quickly, something that we often overlook in our education. Moving then into our fourth epic, we go to after World War II into the post-war era and the Cold War era. And this is, Hughes does an interesting job here. He essentially creates kind of two visions for the influence of technology on society. The first one is one that's captured by Lewis Mumford. Mumford I've talked a lot about. I tend to like how he thinks about things. He argues that modern technology has become something of a mega machine, and it's a system of power that dehumanizes workers and citizens, and it changes the very nature of cities and civilizations, and it's reducing these people to essentially cogs in the machine. A lot of books kind of play on this theme. We go back to Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville in the 19th century. He has this main idea. If you look at Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut, again, very similar idea coming through in this dystopian world. If you have, 1984 by Orwell, which is written in this era as well. Essentially, it's this interplay of the lone atomized citizen against this mega machine, this incredibly complex, society that you're essentially captured in. Mumford goes further in a lot of these areas where he actually uses the Pentagon itself, the building, is kind of this great encapsulation of this very rational, very hyper engineered, but also incredibly complex administration machine. This is contrasted in this piece to Buckminster Fuller, and he essentially has a very techno-optimist vision. We're going to see, I think, Fuller's ideas come alive again when we get to our Techno-Optimist Manifesto. But Fuller, he has a number of technological patents. He creates a geodesic dome. But his idea is really that good design and systems thinking can still solve humanity's problems. And there's really no limit to what humanity can do so long as we put technology to good use. So we see kind of the split between what we think of is technology all good. Is it techno-optimist, or is it does it have some inherent trade-offs? Is it costing us something to get something else? And that's essentially what's going on in this era, which is essentially mid 20th century up until what I would say is the Cultural Revolution. And that's essentially where this book ends, which is kind of after the Cultural Revolution. And it takes the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and early 1970s really takes a change back. If we think of kind of this technology triumphant move that happens, I would say, up until World War II, and then World War II happens, and now there's this kind of question about what is technology? Is it all good for us? Are we still on this triumphant path? Or are or are we beginning to understand that there's some trade-offs in this technological progression? Well, in the period after this split between Fuller and Mumford, what we really see is that the revolution, the social revolution in America, really tends to go towards Mumford in saying, no, there's some definite trade-offs in this technology thing. And in particular, what is very focused upon is the environment. And a lot of the texts that Hughes pulls from this era deal with the issues that we still acknowledge today in terms of smog and global warming and all these sorts of unintended consequences as the result of technology. So, there's a guy, Barry Commoner, is pulled from this section. He has a work on ecological destruction, and that's essentially kind of the main idea here in this section, is that technology has social costs. Full stop. That's the whole idea. We also see Theodore Roszak. He comes back and says, hey, this idea of technocracy, of these experts controlling the decisions of our society, well, that's really undemocratic, and it's actually a form of social control. So you kind of see that cultural communism of the 1960s revolution coming through in its relation to technology as well. And then lastly, you see, I think, kind of that Mumford idea of the Pentagon of power coming through with just alienation, atomization of individuals in these very large-scale systems. I think of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Blade Runner has a lot of these themes coming through that, again, are being written in this era, in the 1960s and the 1970s. So overall, I think this is a really interesting turn that we see in history, is that though we had about 100 years of a migration towards technological triumphism, and we've lost some things on the way. Nobody really is talking about utopia anymore. What we still see is, despite that, we actually then have kind of a reactionary movement in the 1960s and 1970s, mainly centered around the social costs of the environment and of individual alienation. So that's essentially where Hughes's book ends. As I mentioned, he writes in 1975, so he doesn't have a look at the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama's end of history, .com, the internet. None of that is in here. We're going to skip over all of that. I'm sure there's plenty we could look at, and indeed maybe we'll do that in another time. But now what I want to do is take us to Andresen's Techno-Optimist Manifesto. This was published in 2023, and essentially it's an interesting idea. I recommend anybody, I'm going to throw the link in the notes here, just read it. It takes about 10-15 minutes, and essentially it's a very polemical text, And essentially, it reads just like the Communist Manifesto or anything else, where it's positing lots of views and lots of opinions about some of these things. I've taken some notes that I'm just going to kind of reference here to give you an overview of, if you don't want to read it, what's in here and how does that reflect what we've seen in the past coming forward, and also what does it tell us about our society today and how we view technology today. So the first thing that he really comes up with is that technology and civilization are the same thing. If I can find the text here, he says, our civilization was built on technology. Our civilization is built on technology. So here you essentially are having this this equation, right? Is civilization equals technology. Is that all civilization is? In terms of Anderson, there's really no appropriation for culture or religion or anything like that. And indeed, later on, he's actually going to say this is a materialist philosophy. So he's kind of rejecting anything superlative to technology. Everything is downstream from growth, and growth needs to be perpetual. That's the other big aspect of the Techno-Optimist. This harkens back to Buckminster Fuller, who's saying any problem we face can be solved with the correct use of science and technology. And Anderson goes, essentially takes this frame and takes it a step further and saying, yes, and that's limitless. We can, our children will live among the stars. There's nothing that we can't solve through technology. And indeed, he's kind of rejecting that move in the 1960s, 1970s of saying technology has social costs. He's saying, yes, perhaps it does now, but those social costs can be solved by more technology. So an interesting turn there from what we just saw in the previous epic. What he also focuses a lot on is markets. And if you read this text, you'll actually be surprised that despite it being about technology, it has a lot to do with the free market. And this is something I am going to critique this just a little bit, is later on he's going to say that this is not a political philosophy, but it is a materialist philosophy. But a lot of his beliefs about what technology is and what it's able to do is underpinned by a belief in free market economics, which is itself a political economy, is a political idea. So just a little critique there. I don't want to move you in any direction, but essentially his idea is this techno-capitalist machine, which is essentially we're going to make things better and cheaper, and then with that increased efficiency and decreased cost, we're going to reinvest that into capital to create things that are cheaper and better, and then with that increased efficiency and decreased cost, we're going to reinvest that time and energy and money back into the techno-capital machine. So you have kind of this perpetual motion machine that never runs out, and it constantly and forever builds and grows. Another big aspect of the Techno-Optimist Manifesto is he says everything is downstream from growth, or everything good is downstream from growth, which is interesting. It means we can't actually look backwards in history and say, wow, wasn't it great, the art that they did in the Renaissance? Weren't those ancient Greeks really clever with their geometry? In terms of the techno-optimist view, what he's really saying is, perhaps, but the really good stuff is ahead of us. The really good stuff is downstream from growth. And that's essentially what he's ascribing to, is we need to create a perpetual growth machine so that we can always be realizing the next possibility of technology and science. Another portion of this essay is focused on intelligence. He doesn't actually, this is 2023. He doesn't spend a lot of time about artificial intelligence. He talks a little bit about it, but essentially his idea of intelligence is that intelligence is the ultimate intelligence and innovation, I should say, is the ultimate driver and engine of this techno-capital machine. This is the thing that is, this is the alchemy of this, essentially, is I have to turn, lead into gold. The way I'm going to do that is through ingenuity and through intelligence and exploiting what we know is possible through the sciences and technology. So he spends a lot of time on intelligence and innovation, and also on understanding augmented intelligence and what we can use technology to augment our own creativity and our own ability to calculate and do things much faster, which we're already starting to see. I was actually surprised he doesn't get too far into the transhumanist movement. I was expecting a little bit more of that, but you can kind of see this belief in innovation and technology as a good, and therefore augmentation of humans as a good. So naturally, you can kind of take from this a belief in transhumanism, though he doesn't explicitly spell that out or have any real beliefs about transhumanism. You can kind of see the movement there, though. And then lastly, I would want to point to kind of this idea of abundance. He is really believing very much that technology is going to solve our issues and leave us in just nothing but abundance. And this is very interesting to me from the historical perspective, because we can go back and we can look at what we saw in our very first epic in the 1830s. This is essentially what Anderson is presenting is a utopian vision. There's actually there's a part in this manifesto where he says, not utopia, but close enough. So he's saying we're not utopians, but we're getting close enough. So it's very much kind of a callback to the 1830s of creating this utopian vision, but also, kind of bringing that back because utopias are not in vogue right now. But very much he's focused on material abundance. He's focusing on technology driving that material abundance, and that's leading us essentially to this kind of perpetual growth state where we'll always be more happy and more alive and more healthy through the use of technology. It just occurs to me as well. I used to play a video game called Civilization, and essentially in Civilization you work your way through different technologies to advance your civilization. It's a very techno-materialist little video game, strategy game. And at the very end of the game, you just get to something called future tech. And in future tech, we don't know what it's going to be, but of course it's going to have more happiness and more health and more food and more, essentially your civilization grows just by creating more technology. The game I played, was back in the mid 2000s, but you can see that same idea of technology as the way to abundance certainly permeating our society today. So just in closing, I want to end with what I started with, is we have many different views of technology and our relation as human beings, as individuals, as society to technology. And we see that ebbs and flows. There's sometimes larger arcs, larger trajectories, like we see in kind of the technological triumphancy of technocracy and this class of experts that I think is still with us today. But then we also see kind of these pushbacks and kind of this ennui and anxiety in the split between Mumford and Fuller, and in the technological reactionaries of the 1960s and the environmental crises, and so on and so forth. So I hope you've enjoyed this analysis of these two texts. The first one, as I mentioned, is called The Changing Attitudes Towards American Technology by Thomas Park Hughes. I think it's a really fun book. I don't expect you to go and buy it or try to find it, but there you have kind of the overarching ideas there. And I love how it connects with what we see today with the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, and the beliefs and the ideas about how technology relates to individuals as well as society now and our future path forward.